October 14, 1944. The Moselle River, eastern France. Morning fog clings to the water like a shroud, thick enough to taste. The current runs cold and fast, swollen from autumn rains that have turned the riverbanks into mud the color of old blood. On the eastern shore, behind a tree line stripped bare by artillery, German soldiers of the 559th Volksgrenadier Division crouch in their hastily dug positions. Their breath makes small clouds in the cold air. They watch the western bank through field glasses and rifle sights, waiting. The river is their ally now, 150 meters wide, deep enough to drown a man in full gear, fast enough to sweep away anything that tries to cross. No bridges stand here anymore. The Wehrmacht engineers made certain of that when they retreated, demolishing every span, every crossing point, leaving only twisted steel and broken stone jutting from the water like broken teeth. The German lieutenant, a veteran of the Eastern Front whose hands shake slightly when he thinks no one is watching, has told his men what to expect. The Americans will have to stop here. They will have to bring up engineers, pontoon equipment, days of preparation. His men will have time to dig deeper, to bring up more ammunition, perhaps even to receive the reinforcements that headquarters keeps promising. The river will give them time. The river will save them. Then through the fog they hear it, a sound like rolling thunder, but constant, mechanical, growing louder. The sound of engines, not the high whine of trucks or the clatter of half-tracks, but something deeper, more powerful. The fog begins to thin slightly as the morning sun tries to break through, and that is when they see them. On the opposite bank, emerging from the tree line like prehistoric creatures rising from primordial waters, come the American tanks. M4 Shermans, dozens of them, their olive drab paint streaked with mud, their white stars barely visible through the grime of continuous combat. The German soldiers tense, check their Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, prepare for the expected. The Americans will mass their armor on the opposite bank, they think. They will call for air support. They will wait for engineers to bridge the river. This is how modern war works. This is how it has always worked. But these Shermans do not stop at the water's edge. They do not pause. They do not wait. Instead, the first tank, commanded by a sergeant from Iowa who has never seen an ocean before joining the army, but who has learned to trust the strange contraptions the engineers attach to his vehicle, rolls forward directly toward the water. The German lieutenant focuses his field glasses, certain he is witnessing a mistake, some confused American tanker who will realize his error at the last moment. The Sherman reaches the riverbank, and impassibly it keeps going. It slides down the muddy slope and enters the water. And then this is what makes the German lieutenant's hands stop shaking and start gripping the field glasses so tightly his knuckles turn white. The tank does not sink. It floats. The Sherman sits in the water like some metal swan, its tracks churning, creating a wake as it begins to move forward across the current. The German soldiers stare. Some of them lower their weapons slightly, unconsciously, because what they are seeing contradicts everything they understand about the physics of war, about the rules of rivers and armor. One young Jeffrader from Bavaria, who worked in his father's machine shop before the war and understands about weight and displacement, actually whispers a word his mother taught him never to say. Behind the first Sherman, a second one enters the water, then a third, then more. They come steadily, methodically, a fleet of floating steel that should not exist but does. The German lieutenant understands in that moment that the river will not save them, that nothing will save them, that the Americans possess some kind of industrial sorcery, some manifestation of material wealth so profound that it allows them to break the fundamental rules of warfare itself. He begins shouting orders to his men, telling them to fire, to use the Panzerfausts, to stop the impossible things coming across the water. But his voice sounds hollow even to himself, because he knows what this means. If the Americans can make tanks float, if they can cross rivers as if bridges are merely conveniences rather than necessities, then what cannot they do? What limits constrain an enemy whose industrial capacity is so vast, whose engineering is so advanced, that the natural obstacles which have protected armies since the time of Caesar mean nothing anymore? The Sherman tanks are fitted with a device the Americans call a DD kit, duplex drive, though the German soldiers watching them will never learn this technical designation. They see only the result: canvas flotation screens attached to metal frames, raising walls around the tank's hull that displace enough water to keep 30 tons of steel buoyant. They see the propellers at the rear, driven by the tank's engine, pushing it forward through the current. They see what their training, their experience, their understanding of war tells them is impossible. And they understand, in that moment of October fog and cold water and approaching American steel, that they are fighting a nation that has transformed warfare itself, that has industrialized not just the production of weapons, but the very concept of what weapons can do. The history of the Second World War is often told through the lens of great battles: Stalingrad, Normandy, the Bulge, moments of spectacular violence where thousands died in single days and the fate of nations hung in the balance. But there exists another history, quieter and perhaps more profound, written not in the sudden shock of combat, but in the slow, dawning realization of soldiers who began to understand that they were fighting an enemy they could not defeat, not because of superior courage or even superior tactics, but because of superior abundance. The German soldiers watching those Shermans cross the Moselle that October morning were witnesses to this other history, participants in a moment of psychological transformation as significant as any battlefield victory. They were learning what it meant to fight America. The D.D. Sherman was not the only example of American engineering applied to the problem of rivers, but it was perhaps the most psychologically devastating. Developed by the British engineer Nicholas Strausler in 1941 and refined through years of testing, the system had been used with mixed success during the Normandy landings in June 1944. Many of the D.D. tanks launched too far from shore had sunk in rough seas, drowning their crews. But by autumn, as Allied armies pushed toward Germany's borders, the doctrine had been perfected. The Americans would launch their swimming tanks from positions close to shore, in calmer river waters rather than ocean swells. They would coordinate the crossings with artillery barrages to suppress enemy fire. They would send wave after wave, knowing that even if some sank, enough would make it across to establish a bridgehead. It was warfare based on the assumption of abundance, on the certainty that whatever was lost could be replaced. The German army in 1944 could not think this way. Every tank was precious, irreplaceable. Every shell had to be conserved. Every gallon of fuel was rationed. The Wehrmacht fought with the mindset of scarcity, with the knowledge that what was lost today could not be replaced tomorrow. When a German tank was destroyed, its crew might be redistributed to infantry units, because no replacement vehicle existed. When ammunition ran low, soldiers were ordered to hold fire until targets were certain. The contrast between this psychology of shortage and the American psychology of plenty was as much a weapon as any gun or bomb. But the D.D. Sherman was only one tool in a larger arsenal of river-crossing technology that the Americans deployed with relentless consistency. Across France, across Belgium, across the approaches to Germany itself, American engineers demonstrated capabilities that seemed to the German defenders like something from a different age of civilization. At the Rhine River in March 1945, near the town of Remagen, American forces would capture the Ludendorff Bridge intact through a combination of speed and luck. But what happened afterward demonstrated the true scale of American engineering capacity. Even as thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles poured across that single captured bridge, even as German artillery and aircraft tried desperately to destroy it, American engineers were already building additional crossings on either side. They erected tactical pontoon bridges in hours, heavy pontoon bridges capable of supporting 50-ton vehicles in less than a day. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17, 1945, its structure fatally weakened by German demolition charges that had partially detonated during the initial capture, the American advance did not even pause. By that time, 6 additional bridges had been thrown across the river. The Rhine, which Hitler had declared would be the final defensive barrier of the Reich, had become merely another river, another obstacle made irrelevant by American material supremacy. The German soldiers who witnessed these crossings, who watched American engineers work with equipment that seemed limitless in quantity, experienced a particular kind of psychological defeat. They were not cowards. Many of them had fought with desperate courage, in conditions of unimaginable hardship. They had survived the Russian winter, the Allied bombing campaigns, the slow grinding collapse of their nation's military power. They had been told they were fighting for their homes, for their families, for the survival of their civilization against the barbarism of the East and the plutocratic decadence of the West. But watching American tanks float across rivers, watching bridges appear as if conjured by industrial magic, they began to understand that courage and ideology could not defeat an enemy whose factories could produce more in a month than Germany's could in a year. The Americans called their portable bridge system the Bailey Bridge, named after its British inventor Donald Bailey, though American industry had taken the design and produced it on a scale that beggared the imagination. The bridge consisted of prefabricated steel panels, 10 feet long and 5 feet high, that could be assembled by hand without heavy equipment. The panels interlocked with pins, allowing engineers to build bridges of any length, capable of supporting any weight, in a fraction of the time traditional bridge building required. A Bailey bridge that could support 40 tons of traffic could be erected by a platoon of engineers in a single afternoon. The bridges could span gaps of 200 feet or more. They could be built under fire at night, in rain or snow. They could be disassembled and moved to new locations. They were in essence temporary infrastructure made permanent through sheer abundance. When American forces moved forward, they often simply left the Bailey bridges behind, knowing that more panels, more pins, more complete bridge sets were already being unloaded at supply depots. A German combat engineer, captured near the Rhine in late March 1945, told his American interrogators something that appeared in intelligence reports but was deemed too anecdotal, too subjective for official histories. He said that he had watched American engineers build a Bailey bridge across a tributary of the Rhine in 8 hours, working in rotating shifts under portable floodlights, while American artillery fired continuously overhead to suppress German observation. He said that his own unit 3 months earlier had spent 6 days attempting to repair a wooden bridge over a much smaller stream, working with hand tools and salvaged timber, only to have it collapse when the first truck tried to cross. He said that watching the Americans work, he understood for the first time that Germany had lost the war not in 1944 or 1943 or even 1941, but perhaps as far back as 1918, when the Americans had first demonstrated what their industrial capacity could achieve. He said that the war had been decided not by generals or ideologies, but by factories and logistics, by the unsexy arithmetic of production and supply. He said that no amount of courage could overcome the simple fact that America could build faster than Germany could destroy. This was the truth that the German soldiers learned at river crossings throughout 1944 and 1945, a truth more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to waste resources on a scale that made German efficiency look like poverty. The Americans would fire 10 artillery shells where Germans would fire 1, not because they were careless, but because they could. They would send tanks across rivers using complicated flotation systems that sometimes failed, but it did not matter because more tanks were always coming. They would build bridges, and when those bridges were destroyed, they would build more bridges. The German defenders would fight desperately to destroy each crossing point, expending their limited ammunition and fuel, exhausting their soldiers, only to watch another bridge appear downstream, another flotilla of swimming tanks, another demonstration that the material resources of the enemy were effectively infinite. The psychological impact of this realization manifested in different ways among different soldiers. Some fought with increased desperation, clinging to the belief that courage and sacrifice could yet turn the tide, that some miraculous new weapon or strategy would emerge to balance the equation. Others became fatalistic, continuing to fight out of discipline and fear of consequences, but without any real hope of victory. Still others simply surrendered when the opportunity presented itself, concluding that continued resistance was pointless. Intelligence reports from American units in the final months of the war noted that German prisoners increasingly cited not fear of death, but exhaustion and hopelessness as their reasons for surrendering. They spoke of watching American supply columns stretching for miles, of seeing the sky filled with American aircraft, of hearing the constant rumble of American artillery that never seemed to run short of shells. They spoke of rivers that could not stop the American advance, of fortifications that were bypassed, of defensive positions that held for a day or a week, but ultimately crumbled under the weight of material superiority. The symbolism of the floating tank, of steel crossing water in defiance of natural law, became in its way as powerful as any of the more dramatic symbols of American might. It represented not just engineering cleverness, but a fundamental approach to warfare that the German military, for all its tactical sophistication and operational expertise, could not match. The Wehrmacht had been built on the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, the idea that speed, surprise, and concentrated force at decisive points could achieve victory even against numerically superior opponents. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in Poland, in France, in the opening phases of the Russian campaign, but it was a doctrine born of necessity, designed for a nation that lacked the resources for prolonged attritional warfare. The German army could not afford to treat equipment as disposable. It could not afford to build specialized vehicles for single purposes. It could not afford to waste ammunition or fuel. Every German operation had to be carefully calculated, every resource precisely allocated. The American approach was the opposite. Rather than concentrating scarce resources at decisive points, the Americans distributed overwhelming resources along the entire front. Rather than seeking to avoid attritional warfare, they embraced it, knowing that in any contest of attrition, their industrial base guaranteed victory. Rather than developing single multi-role weapon systems, they produced specialized equipment for specific tasks: swimming tanks for river crossings, armored bulldozers for clearing obstacles, bridge-laying tanks that carried their own spans, amphibious trucks that could drive on land and water. Each of these specialized systems was produced in quantities that seemed obscene to German observers. The Americans lost hundreds of DD Shermans to accidents and enemy fire throughout 1944 and 1945, but they kept using them because the losses were acceptable given the speed with which rivers could be crossed. This was a calculus that the German military, operating from a position of scarcity, could not comprehend. The soldiers watching those first Shermans cross the Moselle in October 1944 were witnessing the physical manifestation of this calculus. The lieutenant who had assured his men that the river would protect them had been thinking like a German soldier, operating from assumptions of scarcity and limitation. The American commander on the opposite bank had been thinking like an American soldier, operating from assumptions of abundance and possibility. The lieutenant thought, "The river is an obstacle that will delay the enemy, buy us time." The American commander thought, "The river is a problem for which we have a technological solution, and we have enough of that solution that we can afford for some units to fail, as long as others succeed." This fundamental difference in thinking extended beyond river crossings to every aspect of the campaign in Western Europe. American soldiers in 1944 and 1945 were fed better than German soldiers had been fed even in peacetime. They received regular supplies of coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, fresh fruit when available, canned meat, white bread. The standard American sea ration, the individual combat meal, contained more calories and more variety than the rations issued to German frontline troops. German soldiers captured by American forces consistently remarked on the quality and quantity of food in American field kitchens. Some German prisoners, particularly those captured in the final months of the war, had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations: black bread, thin soup, ersatz coffee made from acorns. The contrast between this deprivation and the abundance of American rations became its own form of propaganda, a daily reminder that they had been fighting on the side that could not feed its own soldiers. The same pattern held for every category of supply. American soldiers wore standardized uniforms produced by the millions in factories that had been converted from civilian production. German soldiers, particularly by 1944, wore an increasingly varied collection of gear. Some units still had standard-issue uniforms. Others were making do with whatever could be salvaged or locally procured. American soldiers were issued boots designed for specific climates and conditions. German soldiers often wore whatever boots were available, and frostbite became an epidemic in German units during the winter campaigns. American soldiers were equipped with entrenching tools, water purification tablets, first aid kits with sulfur drugs and morphine, rain gear, sleeping bags. German soldiers made do with less of everything. This material disparity extended to weaponry and ammunition. The standard American infantry division in 1944 had more vehicles than an entire German army corps. American artillery units fired preparation barrages that expended more shells in an hour than some German units received in a week. American logistics troops operated fleets of trucks, mostly the famous GMC Jimmy 6x6, that kept supplies flowing from ports to frontline units with a consistency that German logistics officers could only envy. The German army, chronically short of fuel and vehicles, increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport even for frontline units. The sight of American truck convoys rolling past columns of German prisoners and their horse-drawn supply wagons became one of the iconic images of the war's final phase. Modernity triumphant over a nation that had, for all its technological sophistication in some areas, failed to fully mechanize its military. But perhaps no symbol captured the psychological impact of American material abundance more perfectly than the Bailey Bridge and the D.D. Sherman, because these technologies addressed a fundamental limitation that had constrained military operations since ancient times: the limitation of rivers as defensive barriers. For thousands of years, generals had positioned their armies behind rivers, knowing that water was one of the most reliable forms of protection. Rivers could not be flanked without long marches. They could not be crossed quickly without bridges. They grew more formidable in bad weather. Defending a river line was easier than defending open ground. Every military academy taught river defense. Every officer understood the tactical value of water obstacles. The Americans turned this ancient wisdom into obsolescence, not through any single breakthrough, but through the systematic application of engineering and industrial capacity to the problem of mobility. They developed multiple overlapping solutions: swimming tanks, portable bridges, amphibious vehicles, specialized equipment for every conceivable river crossing scenario, and produced these solutions in such quantity that rivers ceased to be meaningful obstacles. A German commander could destroy every bridge in his sector, demolish the approaches, fortify the opposite bank, and still watch American forces cross within hours of reaching the water. The psychological effect was profound. Defenders lost the most reliable form of natural protection, were forced to realize that even geography itself could not save them from an enemy with sufficient industrial might. In late October 1944, after the crossing of the Moselle, a chaplain with an American armored division wrote in his diary about a conversation with a German prisoner, a middle-aged Feldwebel who had fought in Poland and France and Russia. The prisoner watched American trucks unloading Bailey Bridge components and asked, through a translator, how many of these bridges the Americans had. The chaplain did not know the exact number but answered that there were enough, that there were always enough. The prisoner nodded slowly and said something that the translator initially hesitated to render into English because it seemed too philosophical, too detached from the immediate reality of war. The prisoner had said, "You are not fighting us. You are teaching us what poverty means." The chaplain included this in his diary because it struck him as profound, this idea that war had become a form of education, that defeat was coming through the forced recognition of material inequality rather than through superior courage or strategy. This education accelerated as Allied armies pushed toward Germany itself in the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945. The Rhine crossings in March became a showcase of American engineering capacity applied at industrial scale. At Remagen, where the captured bridge had become a symbol of American fortune and German desperation, the subsequent construction of multiple additional bridges demonstrated that fortune could be supplemented, or even replaced, by sheer material abundance. At Oppenheim, American forces under General Patton crossed the Rhine at night with minimal opposition, then built bridges so quickly that Patton's superiors in the Allied command learned of the crossing only after it was fait accompli. At Wesel, British and American forces launched a combined amphibious and airborne assault that overwhelmed German defenses through the application of overwhelming force. Thousands of artillery pieces firing in preparation, waves of bombers attacking defensive positions, D.D. Shermans and amphibious vehicles crossing at multiple points simultaneously. German defenders of the Rhine had been told that this was the last line, that the river would provide time to reorganize, to prepare new defenses, perhaps to deploy the miracle weapons that propaganda had promised. Instead, they watched the river become transparent, its defensive value negated by an enemy that treated rivers as minor inconveniences. Some German units fought with suicidal determination, holding positions until they were killed or captured, but increasing numbers simply withdrew or surrendered, recognizing that resistance was futile against an enemy that could build bridges faster than they could be destroyed, that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The young Gefreiter from Bavaria, who had whispered a curse, watching the first D.D. Sherman cross the Moselle, survived that battle and retreated with his unit toward the Rhine. He was part of a rearguard position near Mainz in March, when American forces began their crossing operations. His unit occupied buildings overlooking the river, with orders to hold for 24 hours to allow other units to withdraw. They watched American engineers begin assembling a Bailey Bridge under the cover of smoke and darkness. They fired mortars and machine guns at the construction site, forcing the Americans to take cover, slowing the work. They believed they were succeeding, that they were accomplishing their mission. Then, as dawn broke, they saw that while they had been focusing on the bridge directly in front of them, American forces had crossed the river 2 kilometers upstream using swimming tanks and amphibious vehicles. The Americans were already behind them. The bridge they had been trying to prevent was just one of several crossings. The entire defensive concept had been rendered meaningless by the simple fact that the Americans had enough resources to cross at multiple points simultaneously. The Bavarian soldier surrendered that afternoon, along with the remnants of his unit. In the prisoner of war camp, he saw things that completed his education in material inequality. The camp itself was a temporary facility, erected in days, consisting of tents and wire and guard towers, but it was supplied with more organization and efficiency than he had seen in German military installations. The prisoners received 2 meals a day, not generous, but regular and more substantial than what many of them had been eating in the final months of combat. They received medical care. They were processed systematically, with paperwork and records and a bureaucratic thoroughness that somehow continued even in a temporary camp holding thousands of men. And everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of American abundance. Trucks coming and going constantly, supplies stacked in organized piles, guards with new uniforms and equipment that showed no signs of shortage or substitution. He thought about his father's machine shop in Bavaria, about the pride his family had taken in German engineering and precision manufacturing. He had been raised to believe that German technical expertise was unmatched, that quality and skill could overcome numerical disadvantages. Watching American tanks float across rivers, watching American engineers build bridges in hours, he understood that his father's generation had been wrong about something fundamental. Quality and skill mattered, but they could be overwhelmed by quantity and organization operating at sufficient scale. The Americans might not build each individual item better than German craftsmen could, but they built so many items, with such standardization and interchangeability, with such efficient logistics to move those items where they were needed, that quality became almost irrelevant. An American Sherman tank was in most technical specifications inferior to a German Panther or Tiger, but the Americans built 50 Shermans for every Tiger produced, and they could transport fuel and ammunition to those Shermans reliably, and they could replace losses quickly, and in the end, that mattered more than technical superiority. This was the lesson that the war taught to those who paid attention, the lesson written in floating tanks and portable bridges and endless supply columns. That modern war was fundamentally industrial, that victory went not to the most courageous or the most skilled, but to the most productive. The Wehrmacht had been in many ways an anachronism, a 20th century military force that retained 19th century assumptions about the nature of warfare, that believed in decisive battles and brilliant maneuvers, and the human will as determining factors. The American military, for all its tactical mistakes and strategic debates, understood something more fundamental. That war in the industrial age was about logistics and production, about the unglamorous work of moving supplies and replacing losses, and maintaining the flow of material from factory to front line. The German soldiers who learned this lesson learned it through direct experience, through the shock of seeing their most basic assumptions proven false. Rivers should stop tanks, but American tanks crossed rivers. Bridges should take days or weeks to build, but American bridges appeared in hours. Defensive lines should provide time for reorganization, but American forces attacked everywhere simultaneously, making defense impossible. Each lesson was small in itself, just one more tactical adaptation, one more demonstration of material superiority. But collectively, these lessons accumulated into an understanding that defeat was not temporary, not reversible, not something that could be overcome through courage or determination. Defeat was structural, built into the fundamental inequality of industrial capacity between the combatants. By April 1945, as American and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from west and east, the German military had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Individual units continued to resist, often with desperate courage, but the larger structure had collapsed. Supply systems had broken down entirely. Command and control had fractured. Soldiers fought when they had ammunition and surrendered when they did not. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and was ending not with the apocalyptic battle that Nazi propaganda had promised, but with the slow, grinding dissolution of an army that could no longer feed, fuel, or equip itself. In those final weeks, American forces continued to cross rivers using their accumulated technology of mobility. The Bailey Bridges now span not just rivers, but also the craters left by demolished German infrastructure. DD Shermans and amphibious vehicles moved through flooded areas and water obstacles that German engineers had created as last-ditch defensive measures. American logistics units delivered supplies to advancing forces with the same systematic efficiency they had demonstrated across France and Belgium and Germany. The war in Europe ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with exhaustion and surrender, with German soldiers laying down weapons and walking into captivity, with civilian populations emerging from cellars to surrender to advancing Allied troops. The Bavarian soldier who had witnessed the first DD Shermans crossing the Moselle in October remained in American custody through the end of the war and into the summer of 1945. In June, as a prisoner working in a labor detail helping to clear rubble in a German city whose name he never learned, he saw American trucks bringing in food aid for the civilian population. He saw American engineers beginning the work of rebuilding bridges and roads. He saw American military government officers setting up administration in buildings that had been Gestapo headquarters or Wehrmacht offices weeks before. And he understood with a clarity that was almost painful that the nation that could make tanks float across rivers in wartime could rebuild Europe in peacetime, that the same industrial capacity that had defeated the Wehrmacht would now be directed toward reconstruction, that American abundance would define the post-war world just as it had defined the war itself. Years later, when historians analyzed the campaigns in Western Europe, they would focus on major battles and strategic decisions, on the generalship of Eisenhower and Bradley and Patton, on the fighting at crucial moments and places. But the soldiers who had fought those campaigns understood something that did not always make it into the official histories, that the outcome had been determined by the unsexy logistics of industrial production, by the ability to deliver overwhelming material superiority to every point along the front, by technologies like the DD Sherman and the Bailey Bridge that turned natural obstacles into minor inconveniences. They understood that courage mattered and tactics mattered and leadership mattered, but that all of these could be overcome by sheer abundance, by an enemy that could afford to waste resources because resources were effectively unlimited. The DD Sherman, that improbable symbol of American industrial power, the tank that floated like a boat and broke the ancient rule that rivers protected defenders, became in its way more significant than any heavy tank or strategic bomber. It represented not just engineering but philosophy, not just technology but ideology. It said, we can afford to build complicated specialized equipment that might fail, because we can afford the failures. It said, natural obstacles do not constrain us, because our industrial capacity allows us to overcome nature itself. It said, you cannot defend against us by using geography, because we have the tools to make geography irrelevant. It said, in the end, resistance is futile not because you lack courage, but because you lack factories, and wars in the modern age are won by factories. The German lieutenant who had assured his men that the Moselle River would protect them, who had watched in disbelief as American tanks crossed water that should have drowned them, survived the war and returned to what remained of his home in East Prussia. He lived into old age, long enough to see Germany divided and then reunited, long enough to see his nation rebuilt by the same American industrial capacity that had defeated it, long enough to watch the Cold War play out between superpowers whose military strength was measured in industrial production and technological sophistication. And sometimes in his final years, he would tell younger people who asked about the war that the most important moment he had witnessed was not any battle or any victory or defeat, but rather that October morning in 1944 when he had watched American tanks float across a river, and had understood in that instant that his side had been defeated not by better soldiers but by a better economy, not by superior courage but by superior abundance. He would tell them that this was the lesson of the war, the truth that all the propaganda and ideology had obscured, that freedom and democracy and all the grand ideas that nations fight for are supported, in the end, by the unglamorous foundation of industrial capacity, by the ability to produce more and transport more and supply more than your opponent. He would tell them that he had learned this from a floating tank, and that he had never forgotten it. The rivers of Europe still flow as they always have, unchanged by the wars fought on their banks. The Moselle and the Rhine and all the countless smaller streams and waterways that American forces crossed in 1944 and 1945 continue their journey to the sea, indifferent to history. But for a generation of soldiers who watched impossible things happen, who saw steel float on water, who saw bridges appear overnight, who saw an army advance without pause across every natural barrier, those rivers became symbols of a larger truth about power and possibility in the modern world. They learned that the nation with the most factories wins, that abundance defeats courage, that rivers can be crossed by any enemy wealthy enough to build the right tools. They learned, in the end, that they were fighting not just an army but an economic system, not just soldiers but an entire industrialized civilization that had turned its productive capacity toward their destruction. And the lesson was written in the wake of floating tanks, in the spans of portable bridges, in every crossing of every river that should have stopped the advance but did not. The lesson was that in war as in all things, wealth is power, and America in 1944 possessed both in measures that the world had never seen before. The Shermans crossed the rivers because America could afford to make them float, and that simple fact determined the outcome of everything that followed.